You're listening to episode 87 of Passage Bodle. I'm your host, Rocio Carvajal, food anthropologist, Mexican culture and gastronomy educator. And through this podcast, I explore the gastronomic traditions and cultural history of Mexico. You can find more information about my podcast, lectures, food tour and publications in the description of the show. And you can subscribe absolutely for free to my newsletter, which I only send when a new episode is released. Hello, and welcome to this timely return of the show. I know, I have been away for a while, but believe me when I say I have been busy. In a nutshell, I decided to change PhD programs as the one I was in, turned out to be not the best place for me, nor for my research or academic growth. So I went back to my former faculty and enrolled in a PhD in social anthropology, which, as you can imagine, it meant a lot of paperwork, admin nightmares, and rewriting my whole project. But I have to tell you that I'm happier than ever in every way. Now, today's episode features a conversation I had with Mexican anthropologist Mario Macias Ayala, who definitely does not embody the image of a grad student locked in a dusty library. Mario has embarked in quite a crossover from high-flying international academic life to find his feet back in Mexico, venturing into the bubbly world of craft beer brewing. But before we jump into that serendipitous and enticing path, let me set in big brush strokes the context in which all of this has occurred. We all know that Mexico's relationship with the US is a complex one. Politicians on both sides of the border often downplay the fact that our economic stability relies in a deep interdependence, not only shaped by trade agreements, but most importantly by the work of legal and irregular Mexican immigrants who work in the food industry, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and service, and without whom large parts of the US economy will simply run into a halt. On the other hand, only second to India and China, Mexico tops the world remittance chart with a flow of $67 billion entering the country, according to the 2023 World Bank report, meaning that the economic role of the millions of Mexicans in the US is an essential component of Mexico's and the US's economic growth. But numbers and statistics aside, there are millions of individual stories of struggle, resilience, and hardships that have been the subject of social research for decades. One line of inquiry is a phenomenon called return migration, meaning the experience of returning to the place of origin, in this case, Mexico, a nation that continues to deal with historical poverty, inequity, increased urbanization, that means the depletion of natural resources due to mass extraction, violence, corruption, and organized crime. In recent years, an increasing number of scholars have made significant contributions to better understand the personal, emotional, and psychological toll and implications for returned migrants who, as parents, siblings, partners, and children, have to rebuild bonds of kinship and belonging with their families and communities. And these are just some of the aspects that are at the core of Mario's academic interests and work. So let me tell you more about my guest. Mario Macias Ayala is a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Arizona, where he works as a graduate teacher assistant. His academic work explores two aspects related to migration. One is borderland conflict and violence in the north of Mexico. And the second, as I briefly mentioned, is return migration and reintegration. An academic nomad himself, Mario joined an exchange program during his bachelor's studies at the University of Manchester in the UK. He then completed a master's degree in nationalism studies at the Central European University in Budapest, and now, as a PhD candidate, he spends his time between Mexico and Tucson, Arizona. An interesting byproduct of his academic endeavors is his not-so-secret life as a craft beer brewer, a side project that has led him to establish collaborations and networks with culinary agritourism projects here in the state of Puebla, specifically with a group of indigenous farmers and entrepreneurs who are also returned migrants from the community of San Mateo Osolco, near the green high slopes of the Popocatépetl volcano. Our conversation covers many complex but equally fascinating topics, and we discuss the challenges of how contemporaneous research in social sciences bears the responsibility to creating and empower bonds of allyship and cooperation with communities that in some cases can lead to unexpected ventures. While academic life can be incredibly demanding, Mario and I made an effort over the past months to make this episode possible and make the content of this conversation as enticing and accessible, and hopefully it will broaden your understanding about these topics. Well, I feel I should stop just about now and let you hear about the many lives of Mario, the migrant, the scholar, and the brewer. I hope you enjoy this episode. Mario, I'm so happy that we're finally together after months and months of work and chasing each other, finally ready to record this amazing conversation about some of your projects that are at the core of your research. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice seeing you finally.
Right. So, perhaps one of the underpinning tropes of the cultural and political relationships that defined this dynamic between the US and Mexico is, of course, historical migration. Now, what kind of migration? It can be, legal or undocumented or irregular. And of course, if it's from the north to the south, they all become expats. But if it's the other way around, we remain forever migrants, with all the cultural connotations that it implies. While most Mexican migrants that go to the US join the workforce of the agro-industry, hospitality industry, and the services sector, well, we have a little bit of an example of what happened when Mexicans stopped doing these jobs in Florida with all these laws passed by the Ron DeSantis administration. Your current doctoral research is focused on migration. That's a big topic. So can you give us first a big, broad context that can help us understand how migration is studied, why it matters in the context of Mexican-American relationships?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me here, and finally, we made it. I started with migration while I was doing my BA. First, I was starting with return migration. Now, my research changed. It goes a bit deeper in that sense of the implications of that and the historical context that creates subjects that are displaced or that move from across the border for specific reasons. And when we talk about Mexico-US migration, we need to see it as a labor migration. Like we have different types of migration. We have people that are displaced due to conflict, due to climate change or other reasons. But in this case, we're talking more about labor migration that is not as exclusive. Like nowadays, we see people being displaced as well due to organized crime in Mexico, or mostly when we say Mexico-US relationships in the sense of migration, like movement of people, it's related to labor. And it's one of the oldest and most studied circuits in the world because of the amount of people moving across the border. And going a bit into how to understand it and why it matters in this context. It matters because 1 out of 10 Mexicans live in the US, which is a lot. We also have now like second, third generations living in the US, and that represents almost 34 to 40 million people living there, which is around 11 to 12% of the US population. So we're talking about a big amount of people involved in this process and what it comes with that. So we have cultural exchange, economic exchange as well, labor dynamics happening between both countries, like maquilas, so the sweatshops moving to the Mexican side, and Mexicans like working in the agricultural sector of the US, or construction or manufacturing or service sector, like more recently. It makes possible the US economy. After all, the US economy is built on migrants coming from all over the world in very specific conditions. What makes specific about the Mexico-US is the way in which people is moving across the border. That's very much a policy thing, a rhetoric thing about creating otherness, and that's a strategy in order to control these populations and the labor as such. So that's why we have the rhetoric of the undocumented migrant, right? Like unwanted.
Dangerous, threat.
Yes, and at the same time, we have also the discourse that US population is aging, so they need also labor, but they need a very, very specific labor, and they want disorganized, flexible, and disposable labor, right? So the rhetoric of the border as such, and I'm putting it in quotes, like the illegality, because that's a term used in the media. This has a very specific purpose in that sense, to portray that. So going back about like why is it important? It's important for both countries. After all, Mexico receives a lot of remittances from people living in the US. It's like around 4% of the GDP. The US also benefits from this labor, right? That at the end, it's what sustains like a lot of industries, not just Mexicans, like people also coming from the Southeast Pacific, Central America or Latin America. We see all these populations coming there. I mean, we do have the other way around, but the dynamic is different, right? Yeah. If you move from the north to the south, you're an expat, and you do it under different conditions than the other way around, right? So there's a more like a historical background on that sense for why it's happening that way, right? So we can think about like further categories about like colonialism, like neo-colonial practices, dispossession, displacement, that are like very key terms in order to understand how this movement is taking place and why specifically. That's one part. And also we have a lot of exchange happening, right? Like in a more cultural side that does not need to be overlooked, but we have social networks, communication, different ways of working across communities, across the borders. For example, Tijuana, San Isidro, Nogales, El Paso, Ciudad Juárez. So we have like all these exchanges happening there as well, culturally, economically, right? And also industries that are growing and developing around that is also organized crime. Yeah, like the Maquila, for example, the project is also very important to give us an idea about what that labor represents for both across the border and in terms of those relationships.
So just a quick note, Maquila refers to the manufacturing, fast fashion industry. So like on the very precarious conditions, mass producing all these clothes that keep the cost low and affordable in other parts of the world. But it's only cheap because the cost of labor is artificially kept low.
And we see that the maquilas are no longer just fashion, right? We also have like technology.
Yeah, of course.
We have
car manufacturing.
Like car manufacturing. And that's what happens in the dismantling of the Rusty Belt, right? In the US, like the 4 General Motors in Detroit or in that area, because they move somewhere else. They move to countries that have cheap labor, basically, right?
So basically what you're saying is that migration happens in very specific conditions. So you talked about forced migration due to environmental conditions that make life impossible or unsustainable in certain places. You talk about crime and violence that displaces people. And obviously labor migration. And without oversimplifying, but migration in general from the north to the south, meaning from the US to Mexico, occurs because of leisure. They come as tourists. We go to work. But migration and exploration are quintessentially human traits. Like, we've been doing that, and that is how we disseminated as a species all around the world and the continents, because our inherent need to move and explore. This is a phenomenon that has continuously occurred, will continue to occur, and can allow us to study so many things from very different perspectives and purposes. So just sort of, after this big overview, can you give us some key concepts to understand kind of the basics of migration as a field of study? Like, how does an anthropologist study migration? Or how do you define it? Maybe what are the differences between migrant and immigrant? Why do we need to have these categories?
So you mentioned a bit more about the forced migration, and I wanted to add to that. When we think about forced migration, like, we also apply it to labor migration, right? And then that's because of the context in which the historical processes that created the conditions for these people to migrate into very specific scenarios. When we think about migration in Mexico in the 80s or the 90s, we see it due to the conditions of living in rural Mexico, right? New policies, new ways of articulating the economy, like new subjects, new conditions in the rural areas that force people out of their communities, not only to the US, but also to different areas in Mexico, because of the restructuring that took place in the 80s in Mexico. So we have neoliberal policies that are changing the lives of people and their everyday ways of understanding and seeing the world, and very much pushing them out of their communities. So when we talk about this, or at least like from a historical, more materialist perspective, we frame it in terms of displacement and dispossession, right? Probably not as obvious as it's a war or climate change or a catastrophe that happens, but it's people being displaced from more structural conditions, like a more structural violence that is not that visible, right? And that's what makes it important for us to frame it under these categories of displacing and dispossessing, right? That's a complete different way for someone moving to a different place for survival strategies in a complete setting, right? Because in this new setting, we have borders, we have nation-state framing as such that create a complete different game when it comes to move across borders or across, even in Mexico, like people moving within Mexico, they also move across borders. There are not just physical borders, there are just like gender borders. There are class borders as well, and so on. So,
ethnic borders.
Ethnic, of course. So it's more complex, right? In that sense, that's what we want to do, to problematize that, right? Specific. So I will start with those two categories, like framing it from displacement and dispossession. and not just material, but also the dispossession of the self, the dispossession of the way of being and understanding the world that makes people being out of their places, right? That's what happened basically in Mexico in the 80s and the 90s. And I'll go a bit more on that. So another terms that we also have into consideration is transnationalism, that is like the connecting in terms of time, space, compression, in that sense that keeps that you see Se Viste Niño Dios in New York and things like that, right? Or that you have the food exchange now, the taco boom, right? In not just the US, but all over the world, like the Mexican cuisine, that exchange, right? In that sense. What is key to understand migration in the context of Mexico and the US is temporality. Because between the early 1900s to the 70s, around that time, the number of Mexicans in the US remained around 1 million people. And mostly they were like seasonal workers that were moving back and forth during the Bracero program in the 50s, during labor campaigns to attract Mexicans across the border and so on. We see a complete different scenario in the 80s and the 90s. And that's another key term is accelerated migration, right? In less than 2 decades, we see the exponential growth of people from Mexico moving to the US in a irregular way, in that sense. So from 1.2 million in the 70s, at the end of the 90s, we have 8.5 million around that in less than 2 decades, and that's attributed to the restructuring of rural Mexico as such, right? The difference as well is in terms of temporality and also the spatial way, because the older migrants, let's say older, or they call it traditional circuit, they were coming mostly from the Bajío and Occidente, the Westlands. So that means Michoacán, Zacatecas, Jalisco, Guanajuato, like those were the traditional circuits, right? And they were moving back and forth, mostly just like seasonal workers, like just working for periods of
like
time,
harvest season.
6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and so on, right? It was easier back then, like there was no physical border. And then in the 80s and the 90s, we see a complete different flow coming from the center and the south of Mexico. And that's completely new. They were no longer in the agricultural sector. They were no longer migrating to the traditional states in the US, like California, Arizona, Texas, and Nuevo Mexico even. They were now moving to the East Coast, into New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, and Florida even, right? And they diversify their activities mostly into the service sector. So you see people going to the US from the center of Mexico and the south and working in restaurants, supermarkets, construction as well. That is not a coincidence, you know? It comes with a more global change happening in the world for a demand in global cities in order to become what they are now, because global cities are what they are at the expenses of cheap labor. So who's the people working in these restaurants, fancy restaurants in the US? Like if you go into the kitchens, you're gonna see Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Ecuadorians, Peruvians. That's not a coincidence. That's a demand at the time. And it's not just happening in the US, it's happening in the UK as well, like the growth of London, like big cities, Paris. This is not a coincidence in that sense. And that's why it's so important to have this historical background in order to understand and articulate why and why now in that sense, right? It's a labor force that comes in very specific ways. Is disorganized. It's very important to keep them under the label of undocumented because that frames, and it's a big statement that they are not wanted, but at the same time wanted. They are wanted as cheap, disorganized, and disposable labor as such. So to frame it in that sense, I will add diaspora as well, as there is like another big important. We have second and third generations in the US that they have now citizenship, and that changed the gig for them a lot, right? They can move across the borders. They have connections or ties to both sides, and then that's when we start seeing like these movements as well, like growing in the US, the Chicano movement, the Latinx movement, like coming from these are the voices of these second and third and fourth even generation, like reclaiming or claiming in some cases their spaces, right? In some cases, for example, the Chicano movement, like they are not claiming a space in the community. They are reclaiming a space that was stolen for them, Yeah. So this idea of the Aztlán, I don't know if you have heard of that Aztlán is close to Palm Springs.
Which, for the benefit of the audience, Aztlán is like this mythologized point of origin of the groups that would in time become known as the Mexica/Aztec, who were pretty much the last ethnic group that migrated from Aridoamerica to Mesoamerica, from the north to the south, what is today the south of the US, to central Mexico, specifically to what is today Ciudad de Mexico, and joined the more than 68 different already existing, quite settled indigenous groups. But yes, there is this prevalent discourse and idealized identity tied into this sort of motherland of the Mexica, like a key sort of imaginary place, and to sort of root this identity for the Chicanos specifically. So back to you.
Yes, perfect. These are very big claims, because it ties you, roots you to a place and legitimizes
your ancestry, your
yes,
right to be there.
Your right to be there and so on, right? And it's this push for this community. There is the biggest minority in the US. Yeah, it's their way of claiming their right to be there, to belong, right? That we see it that generational movement, right? And then we have like a third identity, as Gloria and Saldúa mentioned, right? Like ni de aquí ni de allá, right? Yeah. So that's this idea of nor American nor Mexican, but so it's something else.
A liminal,
yes,
a liminal space which they inhabit, because they do not want to lose their tie into the Mexican side of the rooted culture, but also they don't want to assimilate, right? Yet they live there and have created their own identities, but it's a hybrid one, deliberately maintained with that fluidity.
Yeah, and you mentioned another a very key word, right? Assimilation. So assimilation seen under the lenses of displacement, dispossession, and literature of decolonial studies and settler colonial studies. Assimilation translates into ethnocide, right? Into extermination, the logic of extermination. So that's why the push, right, of pushing against assimilating, right? That has that point in that sense. So I will go with those terms. Of course, if we have more, we can always explore masculinities, right? We can always explore other more legal terms, such as citizenship, and citizenship not as just a legal category, but also like a cultural citizenship in the sense of belonging. So categories, we have plenty of those. Oh, another key one is indigeneity. What comes with that, with people that is pushing back against this idea of assimilation. Indigenous communities, because a lot of people that is moving from the rural areas in Mexico, well, not just Mexico, but Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and in Latin America as well, like many of these people are indigenous, and that resistance, right, of
self-identification.
Yes, because of losing that, it's losing everything.
It is the thing they carry with them, and the only thing that will remain with them. So you have presented these several conceptual categories that serve a purpose in order to study them. So these are well-defined ways of engaging with all these different subjects. So as a kind of follow-up question, so migration not only changes the person who leaves, but also changes the people who remain. When someone leaves, they are also living the migration experience, but from another side, right? So they experience anxieties, thinking about the well-being of their loved ones, the expectations of being reunited again. Well, your research sort of taps on both sides, and also is very specific in a very key type of movement, and that is something called return migration. And I have had the pleasure of reading some of your academic work. You talk about how the experience of return migration can be a very disruptive and very traumatic event at the best of times, but is often amplified when it involves, for example, deportation. They are living in this constant sort of legal ambiguity, right? That does not mean that they're ready to leave whenever, right? So they're not mentally prepared for that. They're financially not prepared for that. And they're emotionally not prepared for that return. So I see why anyone, would be attracted to studying the strategies that migrants create for rebuilding their lives here. When you see, let's call it the migrant path, they're thinking about the strategies they're going to do. How am I going to do it? Do I have people that I know on the other side? Do I hire a pollero, someone who can sneak me in the border? How much money do I need to have? Which are the contingency plans that I need to make? And then they go and they have to implement and improvise a lot of strategies on the way. And once they are on the other side, reach out to this network of people they know, might be from their community or not, or the friend of a friend of a friend, to find a job, try to survive there. And likewise, on the way back. I think I can see why you would be interested in that. So I think we should start here, maybe trying to find a broad explanation about what are the characteristics of return migration and how an experience that is so personal and so particular for each person can be considered as a social phenomena. So what are the sort of commonalities across all these people, and how these embodied personal experience can be shared and studied as a social phenomena in this wide national context. Mario just made a big face and opened his eyes very widely because it's a big question.
Yes. When we talk about return migration, we need to see it as not something linear and not like one direction.
Yeah.
That the patterns change, right, across time. And what I consider here important, going back to the historical part, is like, and it's only until 2000, 2006, when we think about return migration, that it becomes like an important topic, specifically in the relationship of Mexico and the US. The thing is that at this point in the 90s and early 2000s, we see the strengthening of the border. Very, very strict laws like against migrant communities, not just Mexicans, but all over. Before let's say the year 2000, 2001, specifically 2001, after 9/11.
Right.
So before that, we have a phenomenon that migration was something circular.
Right.
So people will go to the US, stay there for 1 year to 3 years, that's the average, and they will work there and then save some money, return to Mexico, and if the conditions demanded it, like they will return to the US. And that was possible because it was easier. I'm not saying that it's something easy, even back then, but it was something hard already. But it was easier and cheaper to cross the border, right? So during this time, we see people like telling us that they were paying 500 to 1,000 US dollars to get from the community in Puebla all the way to New York, right? That changes in 2001. 9/11 is when the US starts like building a physical border. So they have like this wall, the wall. Finally, we have it. And we have also the infrastructure going around it, the rhetoric going around it as well, and the policies and the laws going around that, right? So in 2001, with Patriot Act, irregular migration becomes national theme, and then because the illegal, and I want to put it in quotes, you're not seeing me when I'm putting it in quotes, because as the rhetoric, that's a word that we never use, right, to refer to these populations because of the implications of that, because nobody is illegal. That's a rhetoric that has been there for ages, right? We have it in the 1920s with the Great Depression. Like, it's a term very much used against Chinese communities in that region when the big deportations took place, like moving them or pushing them out, or deportations to Mexico or other areas, right, or Canada.
Right. When the all the contracts to build mass rail tracks and they're like, well, thank you very much. We don't want you. By the way, you're illegal. So get off our land. And that's when we see all this mass immigration into Mexico. And it's in one very old episode of the podcast, which I talk about immigrant food in Mexico, why that can help us explain why there's so much Chinese and Chinese-Mexican food in the northwest of Mexico because of that.
During this time, we also see a policy that is called prevention through deterrence. This is mostly in the 90s, right, when NAFTA it's taking place. And the idea is that in order to regulate migration to the U.S., the U.S. government will enforce cities, like border cities. So migrant communities will be deterred to come to the U.S. But what happened is that migrant communities were just pushed to longer and more dangerous routes, basically. And that's when we see also the uprising of the organized crime in the border, right, during this time. And crossing the border becomes more dangerous, becomes not always successful, becomes very expensive. We see that coyotes are now working into these networks of the organized crime that are not just only connected with human smuggling, but other things, right?
And when we talk about coyotes in this context, if you are not from Mexico or the US, we're not talking about animals working with people. Coyotes are smugglers, but commonly referred as coyotes. So you mentioned earlier that it used to cost, about from $500 to $1,000. So in this new scenario where there's longer, more dangerous and more unstable ways to get in, how much we're talking about, how much money we're talking about now?
So 2024, January, the people were telling us that it's around $10,000 to $15,000.
What?
So what it represents or what it means to pay that back, right? Back in the day, you used to pay 500 and 1,000 or 1,000 in maybe 3 months, and maybe you owe it to your cousin, to your dad. Your dad paid for that, or someone paid for that, right? Your godfather even. And now we see that this is a new trend. This is something that we saw and that we have been finding in the field, is that in order to pay that, you cannot borrow 10,000 or 15,000 from your cousin anymore, because
That's
a lot of money, and maybe they don't have it. So they are selling property. So that's a way of dispossessing, which is not that visible. Like credit, like local credit organizations like Cajas de Ahorro.
Legal or illegal.
Or legal, but who has legal access, right? To not even myself.
I don't have the $1,000.
But yeah, so it becomes longer to pay this amount of money. It's extremely dangerous. We also say that before it used to take you a week maybe to get to your final destination. Now it's months. It can be even like a month and a half.
And you're still incurring expenses. I imagine also the debt is affecting the whole of the family.
We see also more like indentured labor like practices. Yeah, that's changing the game, and we see that the industries that are rising, right, due to that is organized crime. After all, organized crime is organized for a reason, right? It's like they're very organized. The mentality of entrepreneurs, and there's no morality around it that they need to go with in that sense. So yeah, we see people crossing the desert. We in the 90s, 94, we still seeing these crises in the border, in the desert, like people dying in the desert, right? Or people dying in the Rio Grande or Rio Colorado because of these new policies. So it didn't deter people to come to the US. It just pushed them into more extreme and dangerous conditions. But they're still moving. And because it's more and more difficult to get to the US, that affects the amount of time that you stay there. So now from 2001, 2002, we see that instead of being there just for 1 or 2 years, they say for 5, 10, 15, and people remain there, right? Because of what it represents, the cost of getting there. And that also affects the relationship that you have with your family of being absent for so many years. That's something that we also found, like the research project that we had together. Family relations are very much affected as well due to that. Like before, you can go for 1 year, 2 years, and then you go back with your family, you have your young kids, and that changes the gig. That if you are gone for 5 to 10 years and you never get to see your kids, right? And they never get to see you. So that changes the dynamics in that sense. And coming to the return migration then is when we start seeing in the literature in 2006, 2007, there's just like these articles, right, that are concerning to that, because we also see like people not making it to the US. We see people returning to Mexico under either deportations or volunteer or forced return. For the first time, we see a change in the net balance of Mexicans entering and exiting the US. For the first time, it became negative. And that was something new in 2008. So that's why it becomes a concern in that sense, right? Mexico is very much dependent on remittances. And at the end, it's like this population that found in migration a way of alleviate their precarious condition, right? Of the dismantling of the rural areas in Mexico in the 80s and 90s. And why I say that it's not something static is because return migration makes it sound as something terminal, that you return, but the idea of going back, and many people go back, right? So it's very much fluctuating, right, in this sense. And also with administrations, right? Like Obama administration was very much centered in deportations, and the Trump administration as well, in more intense way. And the Biden administration at some point was like very strict on that and more relaxed at the same time. So there's like more people going back and forth. And now we see more people going again back to the US. Even people that I interviewed and then that they told me maybe 10 years ago, like, I'm done, like I'm not going back to the US. Either they went back, or they're always keeping this idea, like, I'm considering going back, right? But I'm evaluating my possibilities because it's no longer that cheap, like how much it's going to take me to pay that back, but I also have my debts here and so on.
So the potential gains outrule the risks. So this way in which you have studied return migration has led you to be in contact with farmers, communities of farmers. Specifically, we talk about these different types of areas. Well, we mentioned two big areas now. You talk about kind of central west coast, and then now it has expanded to the state of Puebla, state of Guerrero, state of Oaxaca, Chiapas. So I understand that while the main focus of your research was to understand and follow the personal and collective experience of return migration in general in Mexico, it really led to quite a few unforeseen aspects, which I suppose, proves that all paths lead to food studies, or at least that is one of my mantras. I believe that even if you don't want to, everything has to touch with food. So we can just quickly mention a few of the immediate and likely consequences of the absence. Talk about this absence, and now that people are forced to stay much longer away from the country, away from the state, away from the land, away from the town, away from the community. So in the case of farmers or campesinos, this long absence due to migration has very specific and very concrete consequences, beginning with the reduced local agricultural productivity. So with the shrinking of the local workforce, that leads to the disruption of traditional farm cycles that often result in smaller crop yields, meaning that there's a smaller surplus for fewer communities to sell or exchange produce that has a direct impact in the livelihoods of the families. This translates also into financial vulnerability and the risks of food insecurity, and they might incur even in further debt in order to just survive. So if we complicate things with the growth of urban developments that eat up the ancestral farmlands because they create these cheap housing complexes, then that adds up the environmental loss of these traditionally managed ecosystems that causes long-term or permanent loss of all these areas. And the consequences are something we all experience. We experience extreme heat, like we are experiencing now. You don't see us, but it's very hot here in the library, and it has been very hot and very dry. So, and that is also related to that because the urban areas continue sprawling, which means it overheats, and all the cycle of the water is altered. So just to mention a few of these consequences, and this is of course just you are the expert in these areas, so why don't you tell us which are the more or the most important connections that you have found between farming and migration in your research?
Going back to the events in the 80s and the 90s and the dismantling of the rural sector, especially like agriculture, like cutting on subsidies, cutting on programs for the agricultural sector, had big impacts on the lives of migrants. And that was at first what pushed them, right? Out. And then we see, for example, these movements are like Sin Maíz No Hay País, right? For what it represents, the corn, not just for
food practices.
For food practices, but also for identity, right? Yeah. And during this time, we see import corn that is way cheaper than local corn, right? And what it tells us that, right? In the sense of...
That is transgenic also, right?
Yeah. We need to link this idea like a cosmovision way of seeing and understanding the world, right? Like, for example, milpa is way more than just a crop, right?
Yeah, like a multi-crop system.
Yeah, it's more than that. For people that works in la milpa represents its identity. The milpa represents the connection with the community. The faenas represent the everyday interaction that you go and work with someone and that person is going to help you the day after, and that social cohesion in the sense of what it means, this system. So people that I see returning, they experience a complete different scenario in the US, a very hostile like you're always targeted. You're always like with this sense of, I might be deported tomorrow and I don't know, It's a very hostile environment for people that has no documents in the US. And that's the idea of why I was going back, like why it's so important to keep them that way. Farming, it's also a part of pride and a part of who you are for many people who is returning. And not just farming, like one of the communities is farming, but another community that I work with, there's salt. Salt production for them represents their everything. It's connected to their ancestors, it's connected to the community, to who they are. It's moving into that, trying to rearticulate that, the sense of being and the sense of belonging. Because in the US, you're just a laborer. It doesn't matter if you are gone or no the day after for your employer, because there's someone else lined up for that, right?
And farming also in the US basically occurs under a way of understanding the world from a very Western perspective that is exploitative. And the land and its resources, and in this case, migrants become these resources, and these disposable resources are there to be exploited. And when there's no more to be exploited, they just move on to the next fertile land and available people. Whereas, like you say, under the cosmovision of indigenous farmers, the relationship with the earth, with the land, is not one of utilitarianism. So it's not based on relentless exploitation, but is based on mutually beneficial relationship in which you give and you return. But we can see, what might occur in the experience of the indigenous farmer that is forced in this constant extraction. You can see also why for them it will be almost like a healing process to return to their soil, literally to their terroir. I obviously don't want to ventriloquize anyone or put my words into anyone's experience. I could see myself feeling all sorts of conflict. How do you return from that? How do you heal that beyond the economic aspects, beyond the legal aspects, beyond the political, beyond the policies? How is that experienced and signified?
As you said, like farming it's a way of seeing and being in the world. And I think that there is a push on that for recovering or preserving that, right? Mm-hmm. It's also moving along with this movement of indigeneity happening all over the world, where being indigenous 20 years ago was a reason for shame, right? Mm-hmm. And in many regions still continue to be that, right? In the logic of that, like if you're indigenous, you're treated less and so on. And with this movement of indigeneity and being more critical about what has been done against indigenous communities, is like to stop ourselves there and saying, wait a second, like I am proud of, and I should be proud of who I am and the knowledge that I have about these things that have not been validated by the West for colonial forces and so on. And we are seeing it now, right? Like as you said, the experience of being an agricultural worker in the US is completely different than in Mexico, especially when you have like a monocrop, very intensive and technified in the US, that you have it here, right? As you said, more conscious about what it means, like to take from the earth or the land and to give back to the land, right? In that sense, at the end is land that you're going to be using, not just you, but the next generation, your kids and your grandkids as well. They're going to be using this land, and it becomes the center of life after all, right? Going back a bit, like the link between return migration and farming, I see this push or desire for wanting something different that is dignified and aligned to their views of life, right? And of course it comes with certain compromises and so on, right? We cannot live out of the capitalist part, because that's what makes it part of the contradiction of that, right? Is you cannot live and criticize without reproducing it in that sense. And it's this way of organizing and going back to let's create the chances or the opportunities that can give us a dignifying life here. Mm-hmm. I've seen co-ops, the work that I'm doing when connecting like return migration and farming has been translating into organizing as well, and organizing through co-ops. Mm-hmm. And that you don't work by yourself, that you're not by yourself, that the way that you work the land, the way that you work with the other, you are working in a community. And it creates this sense of cohesion that allows them to be together, right? To go against the idea of individual and going more for the idea of communal and community.
So, as I recall, you have worked with several communities. The community of Ozolco, the people that harvest salt are based in Zapotitlan, which is La Mixteca that connects with Oaxaca. So, tell me a little bit about what these people have been doing, but they're all returned migrants. Everything that you just explained now, it's something they have experienced. So, what have they done once they have returned?
Both communities are returned migrants, and both communities have been starting with co-ops in the sense of working together and getting resources from not only the government, but also like international organizations and so on. And another community that I started working not long ago is Ayotosco de Guerrero. Mm-hmm. And they are vanilla producers, and they're also returned migrants. And all of them are working in the system of co-op, right? So when I told you about return migration and the conditions that might push you to return to the US, and so like co-ops are retaining, right? Or giving the chance not to go away in that sense, right?
And well, that's very interesting, because what some scholars might say, we are domesticating capitalism. So what these communities are doing basically is like, okay, if they're producing things, i.e. food products, they can then enter networks of trade. So they're learning to play the game of globalization, rooted in the traditional structures and ways of cooperation, but now in this other formal way. In social sciences and in anthropology, there was always this traditional view of the resistance. And, we study the resistance of traditional communities to not give in the evils of capitalism or the evils of the Western ways in society. They have as much right and not falling, into the cultural essentialism as saying, no, in order to be proper, authentic, traditional, they need never change, and they always need to eat this and do that and dress this way and only organize this. But no, these are global indigenous. So when you were talking earlier about this indigeneity, this is really tapping into a new way of being indigenous, claiming this recognition as a social being, as a social actor.
Coming back a bit to the idea of domesticating globalization, a lot has been lost. Mm-hmm. That's important to state that, right? And that's because we need to remember that the colonial project was, or had as main core, a point to erase the notion of peoples and to create individuals, right? What we need to see, like these movements of indigeneity and the formation of co-ops, is that they are doing something that goes against that. And that's something very much co-opted, yes, mm-hmm. but as well going against the notion of property, for example, the notion of private property. So we are talking here about communal land, like ejidos, and this land arrangement, like tenure, that goes completely against what it means private property in that sense, right? And that creates a different understanding of seeing the land and the resources that very much goes against the game of capitalism nowadays, right? So when they say the most anti-capitalist that you can do is organize and to be into cooperate and so on. That's the most anti-capitalist thing that you can do at this point, other than, of course, revolution. It goes into this dynamic, and it's not just a co-op, it has further implications in the way of seeing and understanding the world and interacting with each other, right? Like having these closeness and so on. Going about like the success stories, it is very hard for someone that returns to Mexico to start their own business, because we need to think of the money earned in the US as something represents like an income for this person, and that is very hard to save money out of that, because most of the money is spent on rent, bills that you need to pay in the US, the everyday life, and then the rest is being sent back to your house or the communities to pay for the everyday life of your family, education, food, clothes, and so on. That it's very little that you can hold on, especially as these salaries are not as big as they used to be back then, right? Pay the debt, of course. Now it's take you longer to pay the debt. And most of the stories, sadly, of the people trying to start a business, when they return, fail. Most of them. Only 3 to 5% of the people that start a business are successful. But when we talk about co-ops, the rate are higher, right? You already have a network there with people to join resources, right? Like to join money, ideas, time, labor, and so on, that it makes it, in that sense, more suitable for that. And it's not only the migrants, it's their families. So the co-ops that I'm working with is not just the person that returned, but it's also the family, the wives or the husbands or the kids, the grandkids that are involved into these projects. The cooperatives, they play crucial role in fostering like democratic principles, promoting autonomy, and nurturing social cohesion within the communities that I think that are very important, and there is very substantial gain from these communities, other than just the money that they might, for the product that they might be selling. These might be important as well, yes, but if the co-op fail, they have gained already a lot in terms of organizing and social cohesion and knowing that they can work with each other in different projects, right?
Also, I'm thinking, it not only creates a safety net, obviously, in the case of unforeseen events, right? These organizations also keep them safe at an emotional level, at a psychological level, because it gives them an outlet, to express their frustrations, to express their visions, their ideas in a safe environment.
Yes, after all, it's a network, right? That you have and that you build, and that if something happens to you, even let's imagine it, put in as a hypothetical scenario that someone gets sick, right, and needs money for that, you already have this network that you can rely on for that, or other things like social events like your wedding, right, and things like that. These people become, and as you said, it's important that they have the shared experience of migrating and what it means to be working in a restaurant in the US, right? It's something shared. It's something that we don't know because we haven't been there. It's something experienced and vivid for them, and what it means for them, right? That is something shared. Also with the family, we don't know what it means to have someone in the US for a long period of time, that becomes something that unites them as such, right? And create that sense of cohesion. I like to use that word. So in essence, the future holds a great promise for co-ops as a catalyst of the economic development and social transformation. Like beyond their immediate economic impact, co-ops foster a culture of cooperation, solidarity, and shared prosperity that transcends individuals' interests and fosters a more inclusive and equitable society. As we look ahead, it is clear that the co-ops movement will continue to play a vital role in shaping a more just and sustainable world for all.
Well said.
So this is not something that comes out of nowhere. The co-op structure, like co-ops have been crucial in Latin America for a long time. And we have the case of Tosepan Cali in Quetzalan.
That is the northern Sierra of Puebla.
Of Puebla. They have around 30,000 families affiliated nowadays, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, it is far from being perfect, especially at this level. Yep. But if you go there and then you ask if the people that form part of the co-op, if their quality of life has improved, the answer is going to be yes, right?
Yeah.
And they diversify. They started with coffee, and now they have tourism, schools, and they have like this project that it goes beyond like the generational part. At the very beginning, they relied on outsiders, like agronomists, anthropologists, and so on, in order to help them. Now is the second and third generation. They are the heads of these organizations. I have this friend. She's a teacher there. Mm-hmm. Her parents don't speak Nahua, but then she learned Nahua, and her daughter speaks Nahua as well, right? So that tells us more, right? About this is a project that goes beyond just selling coffee or selling vanilla or getting tourism.
Yes, this project, and we're not going to delve too much into it because it is a mammoth project. They sum it up in a concept that is the Yeneke list, and in the 40th anniversary of the Union of Co-ops of Tosepan, they published a beautiful book that is bilingual, so it's in Spanish and in Nahuatl, and is planning the future, and it's a book that literally plans the next 40 years. And what's fascinating about this is that they call it a códice. I'm going to put a link to that book on the resources of the episode, and we're going to go to a little break because we need to hydrate ourselves, and then we're going to start talking now about how he went from books to brewing. Well, now we're going to start with the second segment of this conversation. This is the other side of your work. So why don't you tell us, how did you end up being pulled into the microbrewing world? And what is the fabulous lab of Dr. Chang? I mean, I'm still wondering, who is Dr. Chang and the people behind it? And what type of beers you produce? Is it a lager? Is it a stout? Is it ale? Pray do tell us.
I started brewing in 2012, 14 years ago.
You were a child. Was it legal?
Yeah. Still is not legal. But we started brewing in our houses with our mother's pots. My mom's super mad at me because I modified one of her favorite pots, and then I put it like a bowl. Mm-hmm. It was just terrible. The beer tasted so bad.
Basically, you were making batches of vinegar.
Basically, yeah. It was contaminated during the process, and we had a saying back then, because they tasted so bad. And we had like a very low budget, and it was like very amateur, that every time that something went wrong, my friend said, "Oh, this is like a Dr. Chang thing, you know?" And then at some point, my friend and I, we went different directions. I started my master's, I went abroad. Then my friend started working somewhere else as well, and we stopped brewing. And it was only in 2018 started brewing again. This time in the US with some friends from my cohort in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Arizona, and they already had some experience. I got my first setup with some of the money that I got from working there. And it was basic. It was just 60 liters, which is 15 gallons of beer. And I brought that setup to Mexico and started brewing with some friends as well. But this time with other two friends that they already had a brewery in Cholula. That is like the biggest brewery. It's called Cervecería Cholula or Cholula Brewery. And we do it because it's fun. It brings people together. It's a drink that we very much like. And now we have a nano brewery. We brew all of the styles that you said, like mostly lagers and ales. And what makes it different is that we try to experiment with local ingredients, like ingredients that we come across as part of research. Like with a co-op that I was telling you before, like they knew that I was like brewing, and then like we sat together and then they said, why don't we brew something with corn? It's funny because Mexican beer has corn in it to lower the cost of production.
Oh.
But this is added in a different way, right? Like a specialty grain.
You mean like the big commercial brands?
Yeah, like the big commercial ones.
Like Corona, Indio.
All of them like are highly corn-based as the main grain because it's cheaper.
Right. I didn't know. And probably most people don't know about this.
Because malt, like barley malt and other grains are more expensive, wheat and so on, but corn is everywhere and it's cheap. We use mostly barley malt as the main grain, but we add corn as specialty grain in this case. And the corn is produced from the co-op, that is recovered corn, so are different and more native corns, such as blue corn, red corn, and yellow corn, the ones that we are using. So that what makes it different in that sense. We're trying to experiment. But we also have another plant in Tlaxcala with a friend that has like a bigger capacity. So when we already master a style that we like, we just go to Tlaxcala and make like a big batch.
Which other flavors have you been mixing? So you mentioned corn. Have you tried other ingredients?
We started with corn. That was the first one that we did. And then it's a red ale beer. We wanted to make it really red. So we added prickly pear. He's from producer in Tlaxcala. And also we added malt, the malt that gives these like reddish colors as well. Yes.
So for those of you who don't know, so prickly pears are the fruit of cactus pallets or nopales, as we call them in Mexico. And they produce these roundish fruit that is very juicy, is very sweet, and it comes in very many different colors, namely green, like pale green, some are yellow, but Mario is using the red variety. Does it add a special flavor? Because it's very subtle, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can taste it for sure. At the beginning, we started adding beetroot, but the flavor was not that good. It was a bit earthy. Then we started using carrots as well. The color fades quickly or goes away quickly. What we want to do is like to bring that part together, like the co-op. It's the style that they wanted. They're participating in, and it will be nice to add corn. And they're like, yeah, that will be nice, and that would be good for giving it like this added value, right? To that sense, even though beer is not something from the Americas, beer came with a colony or so, but we're trying to use local ingredients, and most of the ingredients that we are using now, including the barley malt, is Mexican. The only ingredients that we use that are from different places are the yeast and the hops, because hops don't grow in Mexico.
Do remind me, I sort of remember in our previous conversations that you also have added coffee to your brewing process.
Yeah, the second one that we have is a stout beer. The collaboration this time was with Mili and using their black corn as well, and coffee beans from Oaxaca and Chiapas from a coffee shop that is called Inmortal. So for the next batches, I guess that we're going to be using coffee from Puebla, from the Sierra Norte, to add that local theme. We also want to be more like using more local ingredients. And the next one that we are brewing is with yellow corn, and it's going to be a lager, a Mexican lager. And we're still debating what else are we going to add to that that goes with it.
Vanilla? I don't know. You work with vanilla producers, and I'm thinking yellow.
We had already like the first experiment with vanilla in a porter. The thing is that vanilla is expensive.
Yes, it is.
So we don't know how good it is to work with vanilla when it comes to that price. Maybe we can have like batches, like special editions and so that have vanilla. But for example, we are thinking about cocoa beans, right? For the stout, or maybe like jello beer, like the tuna amarilla. I don't know how to say that in English.
Yellow prickled pear.
And yeah.
I am very blown away by all of these combinations. So we've established that, it is commonly produced in general beer, using malted barley. I will briefly mention that, there's other cereals, just like Mario said, that can be used to produce beers. So he mentioned the use of corn, but of course you can use wheat, you can use rice, oats, and even sorghum. So all of these will have different flavors, of course, and different densities. And there's hundreds of microbrewers that are also experimenting with all of these different combinations. And I was in preparation reading some academic papers about it, of course. And I found out that people, like Mario said, they're using blue, red, yellow corn, but also guajillo chiles, for example, as the main ingredient, also to provide color and flavor. So that is crazy. I had never heard about using chiles to produce beer. So that what it produces is that enhances the organoleptic, or like the sensory profile of beers, because it alters the color, the density, smell, of course, the flavor. So looking at the technical sensory aspect of your beers, what makes them different? When you use corn, how does that alter, the sensory experience?
For example, like when home brewing started in the US, like in the 70s and 80s, like brewers, especially in Europe, they were like super strict about what makes a beer, right? Needed to have 4 ingredients and no more, right?
Okay.
And that would be water, a grain that will give you the sugar, hops, and yeast. That's it. But in the US, like with the boom of home brewing, like they added a fifth element that is just like add-ons. Right. That it can be anything, you can put stones, you can put, as you said, chili, you can put corn, you can put whatever you want. We are following a bit that line of, first of all, like trying to use as many local ingredients. They are also consistent with what we are familiar with, right? Like there's people doing beer with moles. For example, for Casa Reina or El Mural de los Poblanos, they had beers with mole.
This is how much I don't drink beer. Like I have no idea.
The limit is the creativity in that sense. So we wanted to play a bit with that, Like beer not being something very Mexican, only after the 18th century, that it's like mostly propagated and open to the consumption to the vast majority of the population. How is that embraced into the culture, and how is that transformed, right? And
kind of reappropriated.
Yes, reappropriating it and adding your own the flavors that you want and that you think they are gonna taste good in this idea of innovating, right?
I briefly mentioned that I was reading some papers in preparation, and of course in recent years there has been an increasing abundance of studies about the interconnectedness that craft beer as a movement creates. Research suggests that the mix or the milieu of social, natural, and economic factors in local microbrewing can highlight, enhance local traditions, honor the ingredients and the history of the production of these ingredients, and in a way kind of enables both the consumers and the producers to create proposals and discourses about what heritage is, what authenticity is, channeling the creativity and also making it sustainable. You have created this partnership with the farmers of San Mateo Solco that had led to the creation of, you will correct me if I'm wrong, 2 of what it will become a trilogy of beers, Magma and Nixley. So would you tell us more about this partnership?
I met them first through their Coyotitla project. That is an ice cream project with corn and cacao and coffee and so on. And I was just amazed, like, oh no, how good they were, and then how creative that was. It did not even cross my mind that something like that was possible. And at that point, with some partners that I have in a restaurant, we were looking for someone to sublet. We thought about them to offering it, and maybe they wanted to start a project. And then I met Leo Telles, Espiridion, Verna, and then we shared the project, the idea that they could use a space. They told us that they were looking for a space because they wanted to start a restaurant. It was a click right away. So that's how we started, like, at first knowing each other, right? Because at first I didn't know what they were doing. I didn't know about, like, the project of recovering and preserving corn. I thought that it was just like doing ice cream or corn chips as well. Like, I started learning more, and at some point is what's leading me as well to my academic interest as well. It's not something that I search for. It's something that just was in my face, telling me, yelling at me, like, pay attention to this. So I didn't work with co-ops before. I didn't work with corn or like food. I was mostly just in the return migration and migration part. And somehow it led me to explore more after all, right? To go deeper in that. I was very open for them as well. They know what I do. That's how the collaboration started. Like, we started as getting to know each other, becoming more friends, like having drinks together. They invited me to parties and so on, to later starting collaborating in other projects, not just the beer, but we have a project called Masa together now, and that's part of that getting to know each other and collaboration and expectation as well, right? As researchers or people that go into the field, it's not that we can just go there pretending that we're just going to extract the information and leave and so on. There are also expectations, and that's how the collaboration basically started.
Kind of social business ecosystem. They foster that social and spatial interconnectedness through these key projects. No, I think I'm interested in knowing how much of that social terroir building is something that you started deliberately creating together, or is just a byproduct? Is it now a conscious thing that you decide to do, like writing this new discourse of food heritage? I'm dying to know what are the discussions like inside these meetings.
So it started by accident, basically, right? We just started like, it will be nice to have a beer that has corn, but later on you learn the implications of that, right? When it comes to connecting spaces. I guess that now it's more conscious, what we are doing and the discourse that we are using when it comes to the products that we use or the ingredients that we use with brewing, right? And then I myself want to get more involved with local producers, for example, coffee producers, right? I didn't know the coffee producers, for example, for the Nextly beer that we use. Like basically, we knew the person that was like roasting the grain. So that's how it became, like the partnership became with that person. But now it can be with the producers themselves, right? And that they are local and that they are from Puebla. and so on. So we want to connect that for also what it represents, a product that is local, a product that is thought or produced by everyone. So Magma is the first beer that we brewed. And Magma, we said it because it's red. But the next one is called Nextly. And Nextly in Nahuatl is smoke or ashy. That's the name that came when we sat with Mili. So this is a dark beer. It's a stout. And they sometimes come as well to brew with us with the small batches. They gave us the grain. They give us their ideas, right, as well. Deciding names, deciding the styles, like it's all part of the discussion, right? With the next one is that we gave them like 3 or 4 different styles of beer that they think that is going to go well with yellow corn. This already has a purpose that is like a gastronomic experience.
So we don't know yet what the name of the next beer is going to be.
Something pale.
It will
Pale
be
in
something
Nahuatl.
pale. Very curious. I might even try it, you know, in pursuit of knowledge and research. I might. And your career might seem, you know, slightly unconventional in combining entrepreneurship and research. But I mean, do you think this is the way forward for present and future academics? Like, do you see something similar occurring with your colleagues? How does it might have to redefine the rules of engagement with the, you know, quote unquote, real world and universities and research activities?
The first time I went to the field, I remember that I was trained basically as a classic, under this like classic umbrella of you go to the field and you stay there, take your notes and so on, and then you leave, you write your thesis, and sometimes you don't even return to the community or you forget about them, basically, right? I was very touched by, when I was doing my research, doing my BA, they were asking me, so all these things that you're asking me and all this work that you're doing, how is gonna impact my life? And I couldn't answer that for a long time, right? And I was all the time thinking, I don't know, right? And it took me a while. I was thinking like, how can we create a more reciprocal process that allows for a more horizontal relationship with them? And I didn't have the answer only when I started my PhD, and then my advisor, Diane Austin, and she introduced me to a model called community-based participatory research, and more into critical indigenous methodologies. And they dive more into trying to be more respectful with the community and creating collaborations that includes them, not as subjects of study, but as partners, right?
Yeah.
So collaborators and so on. That's what I started like working more with CBPR, that is community-based participatory research. That means that they actively, the community members participate in the phases of research, from planning and design and data collection and so on. And maybe one of the themes that is very important for CBPR is that everybody has an expertise in this synergy, right? This is important as this approach not only helps to ensure that the research is relevant and beneficial to the community, but also empowers the members by valuing their knowledge and their experiences. And on the other side, critical indigenous methodologies that are more based on the principles of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, and that these methodologies recognize the importance of traditional knowledge and seeks to integrate this indigenous perspective or other ways of knowing into the research process. So this model promotes more horizontal relationship between researchers and communities, and respects their knowledge system and cultural perspectives as unique within the community. So yeah, I think that it can move into that direction about the way that we go into the communities, and that we are more critical and we take a step back and then we think like and listen to what they have to say and ask for them, as we have the responsibility to reciprocate that. We're getting something out of that. They want something out of that, right? And we need to honor and respect that.
So it is, of course, by no means desirable and well-meaning shift that we should all aim to. But it can also become a very heavy burden to put on researchers. Oh, you need to now change all of these structural inequalities, and now it's on your shoulders and you have the responsibility to reshift these relationships. And you're like, doesn't mean it's not doable, right? But it comes with its own challenges, no? So a little bit, you have defined collaboration in the form of adding up to their efforts. May these be in their agribusiness, in the food projects that they're doing. So basically, you, particularly yourself, you are translating that allyship into concrete, productive projects that not only are generating an income to you, but also diversifying their sources of income for them. Is my read correct there?
Yes. I mean, the key words in CBPR is collaboration, right?
Yeah.
And partners. I guess that what is gained here is a way of organizing around that you can rely on each other for many other things that are beyond the product, right? And that's like creating that social cohesion that if I step away or if I go away, like they don't need me because the structure is there, that gap can be somehow mediated, right?
Which does not mean that it's the same logic of being replaceable in, a Western hyper-capitalistic context, right? It's more about the organic nature of cooperation.
Yeah, and commitment as well, right? They give us their time. They are committed to our project. So I try to be committed as well to their project and their cause, right? For me, even it can transform that way of me not being there. For example, if I go back to the US and I no longer take the role of maybe working for funding, right? But I work more in promoting now, the talking in depth about their work, their products, maybe even trying to open the market for them, right? In the US. So for me, it's important that it's not just a project that I work, but it's also a project that I admire on their end, right? I admire what they have done and how much that changes their quality of life for them. I love how Leo puts it, right? He says like we're living the Mexican dream, not having to go to the US and being proud of being a Nahua person here, happy working La Milpa. So that's what I admire, right? That they are creating that for them. Finally, I just want to thank Leonardo, Espiridion, Bernardo, Enrique, and Álvaro, that I'm here talking right now, but they are very much the project as well. So,
of course.
Thank you.
People might be interested in knowing a bit more about your work.
The easiest way is to go on Google Scholar.
Excellent.
Or Google and just type my name, Mario Macias Ayala. Just search for migration or return migration. And then I'm co-publishing an article now with one of my advisors, my mentors, with Dr. Alison Leeds on fatherhood and migration. And that's going to be open access. You can also send me an email and I can share like some of my work at Mario Macias AA at Arizona EDU.
Mario, thank you so much for the time, for the generosity. Be very happy to talk for another 3 hours with you.
Thank you and bye.
And now I have some bonus content for you. I figured, like me, many of you might not be beer experts or alcohol researchers. So I decided to add this little segment to mention some of the arguments and reasons why human societies started brewing beverages and what happens during this magical process. In the book A Short History of Drunkenness by Mark Forsyth, he nicely sums up 6 arguments that explain why Neolithic societies started brewing. Number 1. Beer apparently is easier to make than bread, and you do not require an oven to do this. 2. Beer contains vitamin B that can be obtained by eating other animals, but fermentation of wheat and barley also produces vitamin B with much less effort. Número 3. Beer is a better food than bread. Why? Well, the yeasts make it way more nutritious and easier to digest. 4. It can be stored and consumed later, a lot later than bread. 5. The alcohol in beer purifies the water that is used to make it, killing all the nasty bacteria. And last, número 6. The biggest argument is that the ultimate desire to consume beer regularly might have been the most important cultural drive to encourage the abandonment of a nomadic life and transition into a sedentary agricultural lifestyle. Now, summing up in 3 big steps, the brewing process occurs like this. It all starts with the malting. What is malting? Well, the grains, whichever grain you use, are steeped in water to induce sprouting. Now, this helps release an enzyme that converts starches into sugar. The process is halted, meaning it is stopped, by drying the grain. You can do this either by air exposure or heat in malting ovens. The degree of roasting affects the beer color. With longer roasting, that results in a darker beer. Malted grains are then crushed or flattened. And that takes us to the second step, mashing, which is the actual brewing process. Now, warm water is added to these crushed malted grains, and that makes it into a mash. The enzymes convert the starches into sugars, and this sugary mixture is called wort. And this is the moment when hops are added. Now, hops were introduced into the brewing process in the medieval period. Why? Because it has amazing preservative effects and also adds a layer of flavor. Fermentation. When the mash is steeped to allow the starches to convert into sugars, the liquid wort is separated from grain solids. The wort then will be boiled cold and drained into a large fermenting tub or barrels, and then it is up to the brewer to determine how much alcohol you want to develop in this fermentation process. Thank you for listening. This episode was researched and presented by me, Rocio Carvajal, and Mario Macias. Edition and post-production was made by yours truly. For those interested in knowing more about Mario Macias' work and the projects we mentioned during this conversation, I have put together a list of resources for you, including books, papers, and links in the description of the episode. And there's a special blog post on my website, and of course, if you are subscribed to my newsletter, you already received all of this in your inbox. If you follow me on Instagram, you will notice that I have added tags to this episode's post so you can know and follow Mili, Coyotitla, Masa, Dr. Chang's Lab, Mazolco, and El Rinconcito. And of course, I have tagged Mario. If you have any questions, comments, or just want to say hi, reach out to me on social media, or you can drop me a line to hello@pasachipotle.com. Well, that's it for me today. I have a flight to catch in a few days, but you can expect another episode soon from the other side of the Atlantic. Take care. Until the next time.